5 years. That's how long it had been since my sister Victoria looked me in the eye and told me my son wasn't welcome at Christmas anymore. 5 years of excuses that grew thinner each holiday season, of phone calls that went straight to voicemail, of family photos posted online where Tyler's absence screamed louder than any caption could explain. And then there I was, standing in the doorway of my mother's house on Christmas Eve, uninvited and unannounced, watching through the frosted window as my sister's children tore through mountains of wrapped presents while my 8-year-old son sat in our car, bundled in his winter coat, asking me why Grandma didn't want to see him this year. I hadn't planned on showing up. For 5 years, I'd honored their boundaries, swallowed my hurt, and built a different kind of Christmas for Tyler, one filled with hot chocolate and science museums and light displays where he could stim freely without judgment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But this year felt different. This year, Aunt Ruth had called me 3 days before Christmas, her voice shaking with something between rage and grief, telling me I needed to see what was happening in that house. Telling me that silence had protected them long enough. The wreath on my mother's door still had my father's initials woven into the pine branches, a memorial to a man who died believing his daughters would always take care of each other. I could smell the cinnamon candles burning inside, could hear the fireplace crackling, could see the tree lights twinkling through the bay window. Everything looked exactly as it had when I was a child, when Christmas meant belonging, when family meant safety. Everything except the fact that my son was considered too difficult, too different, too much for them to handle during the most wonderful time of the year. Victoria saw me before I knocked. Through the window, our eyes met, and I watched something flicker across her face. Not quite guilt, not quite surprise, but something close to both. She disappeared from view, and 30 seconds later the front door opened just wide enough for her body to block the entrance. Her cashmere sweater was the color of fresh snow, her hair pulled back in the same perfect twist my mother had always worn to holiday parties. She looked every bit the successful corporate attorney, the golden child, the one who had done everything right. "Caroline," she said, my name sharp in her mouth like she'd bitten into something sour. "We talked about this. This is a family gathering." I felt the words land like ice water down my spine, but I'd spent 5 years preparing for this moment, 5 years building armor out of therapy sessions and support groups and late-night conversations with other mothers who understood what it meant to love a child the world kept trying to exclude. I shifted the gift bag in my hands, Tyler's carefully wrapped present for his grandmother inside, and smiled the way you smile when you already know how the story ends. "I know," I said quietly. "That's why I'm here." Before she could respond, before she could close the door or call for our mother or do whatever she'd planned to keep us out, a voice carried from inside the house. Clear, amplified, unmistakable. My mother's voice, but not speaking to the family gathered around her fireplace. Speaking to a room full of people I couldn't see. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight," Patricia Hayes Morrison said, her words floating through the doorway like ghosts of every speech she'd given at country club luncheons and charity galas. "Especially Dr. Diane Foster, whose work with neurodivergent children has transformed our community. Dr. Foster, would you please stand?" The applause that followed made Victoria's face drain of color. I watched her throat work, watched her try to find words that wouldn't come. Because she knew. In that moment, standing between me and the warmth of the house she'd worked so hard to keep me out of, she finally knew. The woman my mother was honoring, the doctor whose research and advocacy had earned recognition from the State Board of Education, the expert who had been featured in newspapers and morning shows for her revolutionary approach to inclusive learning, was me. Dr. Caroline Hayes. The daughter they'd spent 5 years pretending didn't exist. The mother of the child they'd deemed too broken to deserve a seat at their table. You probably want to know how we got here. How the girl who used to string popcorn garlands with her sister became the woman standing on her mother's porch, locked out of Christmas while being celebrated inside. How the boy they rejected became the reason I built something they couldn't ignore. So let me take you back, because this story doesn't start with exclusion. It starts with a little boy who saw the world differently, and a family that couldn't handle the mirror he held up to their perfect lives. I grew up believing family was everything. My parents raised Victoria and me in a white colonial house in Maplewood, Vermont, the kind of place where everyone knew your name and your business and the two were considered inseparable. My father William was a civil engineer who built bridges, actual structures of steel and concrete that connected one side of a river to another. My mother Patricia taught piano lessons in our living room, her students a parade of children who would rather have been anywhere else, learning scales they'd forget the moment they walked out our door. Victoria was older by 3 years, which in childhood mathematics meant she was wiser, prettier, more capable in every way that mattered. She was the one who got straight A's without trying, who was elected homecoming queen, who dated the quarterback and actually married him later, though that marriage lasted about as long as his football career. I was the one who brought home stray cats and kids who ate lunch alone, who asked too many questions in church, who cried during every Sarah McLachlan commercial and meant it. But we were close, or I thought we were. We shared clothes and secrets and a bathroom that was perpetually too small for 2 teenage girls. Victoria taught me how to apply eyeliner without looking like a raccoon. I helped her write her college essays, the ones that got her into Yale. When our father died suddenly of a heart attack the summer I turned 22, we held each other at his funeral and promised we'd never let distance come between us the way it had between him and his brother. That promise lasted exactly as long as it took for me to get pregnant. I met Marcus Hayes at a community center where I volunteered, teaching art classes to kids whose parents worked 3 jobs and couldn't afford summer camps. He was a carpenter building new shelves for the library, all quiet competence and capable hands, and he had this way of listening that made you feel like your words mattered. We got married in my mother's backyard, Victoria standing beside me in lavender, already 4 months pregnant with her first child. Our mother cried through the entire ceremony, clutching a handkerchief embroidered with my father's initials, saying how proud he would have been. Tyler came into the world on a Tuesday morning in March, 7 pounds and 3 ounces of squalling, perfect humanity. He had my dark hair and Marcus's gray eyes and lungs that could wake the entire maternity ward. Victoria brought Natalie to the hospital, her own daughter just 2 years old, already walking and talking in complete sentences. I remember thinking how wonderful it would be, raising cousins so close in age, how they'd grow up like siblings, how our children would have what our father and his brother never managed. For the first 2 years, everything seemed fine. Tyler hit his milestones, mostly. He was a little late to walk, but so was I according to my baby book. He didn't talk much, but boys develop slower than girls, everyone said so. He liked routine and got upset when things changed, but what toddler doesn't? I pushed down the small voice in my head that whispered something was different, because different in my family had always meant difficult, and difficult had always meant disappointing. The first real crack appeared at Natalie's 4th birthday party. Victoria had rented out the Oak Ridge Community Center, the same place where I'd met Marcus, and transformed it into a princess palace complete with a bounce house and a woman in a Cinderella costume who couldn't have been more than 19 and looked deeply uncomfortable in her polyester ball gown. Tyler was 2.5, and the noise and chaos should have delighted him the way it did the other children. Instead, he sat under a table in the corner, hands pressed over his ears, rocking back and forth with an intensity that made my chest tight. "Caroline," Victoria said, her voice sticky sweet the way it always got when she was about to criticize me in public. "Maybe you should take him outside. He's upsetting the other children." I looked around the room. No one was paying attention to Tyler except Victoria. The other kids were screaming and running and shoving cake into their faces with the savage joy of tiny humans hopped up on sugar. But Tyler, quietly overwhelmed in his corner, was the problem. "He's fine," I said, though he clearly wasn't. "He just needs a minute." "He's been under there for 20 minutes, Victoria pressed. "And he's making that sound." That sound. Tyler was humming, a low steady vibration that helped him regulate when the world got too loud. I didn't know that then, didn't have the language for it yet. All I knew was that my son was hurting and my sister wanted me to hide him. I gathered Tyler up and left, making some excuse about nap time that fooled no one. In the parking lot, he finally stopped rocking and looked at me with those storm cloud eyes, and I saw something in them I recognized. The same overwhelm I'd felt at every forced social gathering my mother had dragged me to, every party where I'd hidden in the bathroom, every loud restaurant where I'd wanted to crawl out of my skin. Tyler wasn't being difficult. He was being honest about what the rest of us had learned to pretend we could tolerate. That night, Victoria called. "I think you should get him evaluated," she said, no preamble, no softness. "Something's not right." The words hung in the air like a diagnosis, like a verdict, like a door closing. And maybe I should have thanked her for being direct, for saying what I'd been afraid to acknowledge. But all I heard was something's not right with your son, and by extension, with you. "He's two," I said. "He's fine." "I'm just trying to help," Victoria said, but her tone suggested otherwise. It suggested judgment, comparison, a silent tally being kept between her typically developing children and my son who sat under tables and hummed to cope with the world. The evaluation came 6 months later, after Tyler's preschool teacher suggested it with the gentle insistence of someone who'd had this conversation before. The appointment was at Brookside Medical Center, in a room painted with murals of farms and zoos, designed to be calming and achieving exactly the opposite effect. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Tyler clung to my leg while a developmental pediatrician asked him questions he couldn't answer, gave him puzzles he couldn't solve, watched him spin in circles and flap his hands when he got excited about the fish tank in the corner. "Autism spectrum disorder," she said, the words heavy with implications I was only beginning to understand. "High support needs. Sensory processing differences. Significant speech delays." She used a lot of words that day, sitting across from Marcus and me in chairs too small for adult bodies, but the ones that stuck were the ones she didn't say. Difficult. Burdensome. Different in ways that would require accommodation, understanding, a complete reorganization of how we moved through the world. I called my mother first. She cried, which I'd expected, but then she said something I hadn't. "Oh, Caroline, what are you going to do?" As if Tyler were a problem to be solved rather than a child to be raised. As if his diagnosis had changed who he was instead of simply naming what had always been true. Victoria's response was more subtle but somehow worse. She started finding reasons why we couldn't get together. Natalie had a cold. Lucas was teething. They had plans, always plans, a calendar that used to include us suddenly full to bursting with obligations that didn't have room for a cousin who needed extra patience, extra time, extra grace. The first Christmas after the diagnosis, we were still invited, technically. But Victoria pulled me aside before dinner and handed me a typed list of rules. No humming during dinner. No stimming with the Christmas lights. Tyler needed to stay at the table even if he got overwhelmed, because leaving would disrupt the meal for everyone else. The list went on, each item a small rejection dressed up as reasonable accommodation, as if a 4-year-old child could simply turn off his neurology because it was inconvenient for the holiday schedule. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and saw something I'd been too close to notice before. Victoria didn't just want Tyler to be quiet and compliant. She wanted him to be normal, and failing that, she wanted him to be invisible. She wanted the cousin her children could play with easily, the nephew who would sit through church services and family photos without needing breaks or adjustments or any acknowledgement that his brain worked beautifully different from hers. "These aren't accommodations," I said quietly, folding the paper in half. "These are demands for him to be someone he's not." "I'm trying to include him," Victoria said, and maybe she believed it. "But you have to meet me halfway." Halfway would have meant Tyler masking his autism for her comfort. Halfway would have meant teaching him to suffer silently so the rest of the family could enjoy their perfect Norman Rockwell Christmas. Halfway would have meant choosing her approval over his well-being, and I'd spent too many years of my own life contorting myself to fit into spaces that weren't built for me to do that to my son. We went to that Christmas dinner. Tyler lasted 45 minutes before the combined assault of noise and lights and too many people asking him questions he couldn't process sent him into a meltdown. Not a tantrum, a meltdown, his nervous system in complete overwhelm, his body trying desperately to regulate itself the only way it knew how. I carried him out of that house while he screamed and flailed, and I felt every eye on us, felt the weight of their judgment and relief in equal measure. Victoria didn't call to check on him afterward. Neither did my mother. The silence lasted 3 weeks, until Victoria finally sent a text message that would define the next 5 years of our lives. Mom and I have been talking. We think it's best if you don't come to family events for a while. It's too stressful for everyone, especially the kids. Tyler needs a different environment, and we need to protect Natalie and Lucas from that kind of disruption. I hope you understand. This is what's best for the family. I read that message 17 times, each word burrowing deeper into my chest. The family, as if Tyler and I weren't part of it. That kind of disruption, as if my son's disability was a choice, a behavior problem, something that could be fixed if I just tried harder. What's best, as if excluding a child from the people who were supposed to love him unconditionally was ever anything other than cruelty dressed up as boundaries. Marcus found me sitting on the kitchen floor, phone in my lap, tears I didn't remember crying drying on my face. He didn't say anything, just slid down beside me and held my hand while I tried to find words for the kind of grief that comes from being rejected by the people who are supposed to know you best. We'll make our own Christmas, he said finally. Just the three of us. And it'll be better than anything they could give us. He meant it as comfort, and it was, but it was also an acknowledgement of a truth I wasn't ready to accept. My family had drawn a line, and they'd put Tyler on the other side of it. And by extension, they'd put me there too. That was 5 years ago. 5 years of Christmases spent building new traditions, of learning to find joy in small gatherings with friends who loved Tyler exactly as he was, of slowly releasing the fantasy that my mother would call and apologize, that Victoria would realize what she'd done and come back to us. 5 years of watching social media posts of family gatherings where Tyler's absence was explained away with vague references to scheduling conflicts and different priorities. 5 years of my son asking why Grandma didn't want to see him anymore, and me struggling to find answers that didn't make him feel like he was the problem. But something changed in those 5 years. Something Victoria and my mother couldn't have predicted, didn't see coming, because they'd stopped paying attention to what I was building in the space their rejection had created. I went back to school. Started with a master's degree in special education, driven by the realization that if I couldn't find the support Tyler needed, I'd learn to create it myself. The degree led to research opportunities, to conference presentations, to a doctoral program that focused on inclusive education models for neurodivergent children. I wrote my dissertation on family systems and disability, on the ways families either adapt to include all their members or fracture around the ones they deem too different. I didn't write about Victoria explicitly, but she was on every page. 3 years ago, I founded the Riverside Neurodiversity Center in Portland, a place where kids like Tyler could learn and play and exist without having to sand down their edges to fit into spaces not built for them. We started with 5 families meeting in a rented church basement. Within a year, we had a waiting list. Within 2 years, we'd secured funding from the state. By this year, we'd become the model program that other communities were trying to replicate, the gold standard for what inclusive support could look like when you actually listen to autistic people and their families. The local news covered our expansion. Then the state education board invited me to present at their annual conference. Then the governor's office called about an advisory position. Each recognition felt surreal, like I was living someone else's life, because the girl who'd been told her son was too difficult for family Christmas couldn't possibly be the same woman being asked to shape state policy on disability services. But I was. I had taken the rejection that was meant to diminish me and used it as a foundation to build something that couldn't be ignored. And then Aunt Ruth called. Ruth was my mother's younger sister, the one who never married, who taught elementary school for 40 years and spent her retirement volunteering at the library and saying things at family dinners that made everyone uncomfortable because they were true. She'd always been kind to Tyler, in that distant way of elderly relatives who don't quite know how to connect with children but mean well. I hadn't heard from her in months, not since she'd sent Tyler a birthday card with a $20 bill inside and a note that said "Keep being exactly who you are." When her name appeared on my phone 3 days before Christmas, I almost didn't answer. I was in the middle of reviewing grant applications, Tyler was at his after-school program, and I'd trained myself not to expect good news from anyone connected to my mother's side of the family. But something made me pick up, some instinct that the walls I'd built around my heart still had small cracks where hope could seep through. "Caroline," she said, and her voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. "I need you to listen to me, and I need you not to hang up until I'm finished talking. I set down my pen and turned away from my computer screen, giving her my full attention in a way I hadn't given anyone from my family in years. Your mother is hosting a Christmas Eve gathering, Ruth continued. She's invited half of Maplewood, turned it into some kind of charity showcase for the community center board. She's been planning it for months, making it the social event of the season. And Caroline, your sister's children are going to be showered with gifts in front of everyone. Victoria's been posting about it online, counting down the days, talking about how blessed her family is. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Why are you telling me this? Because Tyler's name hasn't been mentioned once, Ruth said, her voice cracking. Not once in 3 months of planning and posting and preparing. And when I asked Patricia about it, when I said surely you'd be inviting Caroline and Tyler, she looked at me like I'd suggested inviting a stranger. She said you'd made your choice to prioritize Tyler's needs over family harmony, and this was a family event. The words landed like physical blows. I'd known we were excluded. I'd made peace with it, or thought I had. But hearing it confirmed, hearing that my mother had turned our absence into a moral failing on my part, that she'd reframed Tyler's disability as a choice I'd made that somehow justified cutting us out, it opened wounds I'd thought had scarred over. Ruth, I appreciate you telling me, but I don't know what you expect me to do with this information. Show up uninvited? Make a scene? Prove them right about me being difficult? I expect you to stop protecting them, Ruth said, her voice suddenly fierce. I expect you to stop making it easy for them to pretend Tyler doesn't exist. Caroline, do you know what your mother told the community center board when they asked about her family? She said she has 1 daughter and 2 grandchildren. 1 daughter. As if you died, as if Tyler never existed. The room tilted slightly. I gripped the edge of my desk, forcing myself to breathe through the rage and grief warring in my chest. 1 daughter. My mother had reduced me to nothing, had erased both Tyler and me from her narrative so completely that she could stand in front of her community and rewrite history without even flinching. There's something else, Ruth said, softer now. The community center board specifically requested that she invite Dr. Caroline Hayes to speak at the event. They want to honor the work you've done with the Riverside Neurodiversity Center. Your mother accepted on behalf of the center, but she told them you were unavailable for personal reasons. She's planning to have someone else accept the recognition in your place. Caroline, she's going to take credit for work you built from nothing while excluding you from her home. I couldn't speak. My throat had closed around words too big to fit through. I'm sorry, Ruth said. I know this hurts. But I thought you deserved to know what's happening in that house while you're spending another Christmas pretending it doesn't matter that they threw you away. She hung up before I could respond, leaving me alone with information I had no idea what to do with. For 5 years, I'd built a life around Tyler's needs, around creating spaces where he could thrive, around proving that love and accommodation mattered more than forced conformity. I'd been so focused on moving forward that I'd stopped looking back at what I'd left behind. But this felt different. This wasn't just exclusion. This was erasure. And worse, it was theft. My mother was going to stand in front of the community I served, accept recognition for work I'd done, and never once acknowledge that the daughter she disowned was the one who'd built everything they wanted to celebrate. Marcus came home an hour later and found me still sitting at my desk, grant applications forgotten, staring at nothing. He didn't ask what was wrong. After 10 years of marriage, he'd learned to read my silences, knew the difference between the quiet of concentration and the quiet of someone trying not to shatter. Ruth called, I said finally. My mother is hosting a Christmas Eve event. Victoria's kids will be there, surrounded by presents and family and everything Tyler's been excluded from for 5 years. And Mom's accepting an award meant for me, telling people I'm unavailable. Marcus pulled up a chair and sat across from me, his carpenter's hands folded on the desk between us, steady and sure in a way I desperately needed. What do you want to do? He asked. Not what should you do, not what's the right thing, but what do you want? He'd always given me that gift, the space to name my own desires before drowning them in obligation or expectation. I want Tyler to have grandparents who love him, I said, the truth spilling out raw and unpolished. I want my mother to see what she's missing. I want Victoria to understand that excluding Tyler didn't protect her children, it just taught them that some people are disposable. I want them to feel one fraction of the pain they've caused us. Okay, Marcus said. Then let's go. What? Let's go to the party. You, me, and Tyler. Let's show up and let them deal with the consequences of their choices in front of all their guests. I stared at my husband, this man who'd stood beside me through every meltdown and IEP meeting and sleepless night, who'd learned sign language when Tyler was nonverbal and built sensory swings in our backyard and never once suggested that loving our son was anything other than a privilege. They'll make a scene, I said. Victoria will try to have us removed. My mother will act like we're ruining everything. Good, Marcus said. Let them. Let everyone see who they really are when forced to acknowledge what they've been hiding. That night, I lay awake long after Marcus fell asleep, weighing choices that felt impossibly heavy. Part of me wanted to maintain the distance I'd worked so hard to cultivate, to protect Tyler from people who'd already proven they didn't deserve access to his beautiful, complicated existence. But another part, the part that was still that little girl who'd strung popcorn garlands with her sister and believed family meant forever, that part wanted one more chance for them to choose differently. In the end, it was Tyler who made the decision for me. He came into our bedroom at dawn on Christmas Eve morning, his hair sticking up in 17 different directions, clutching the gift he'd made for his grandmother in art therapy. It was a painted clay handprint, glazed in shades of blue and green that reminded me of ocean waves. On the back, his therapist had helped him spell out, "To Grandma, love Tyler." "Can we give this to Grandma today?" he asked, his voice still rough with sleep. I made it special. I looked at Marcus, who nodded slightly, and I made a choice that terrified me. We were going to show up. Not to make a scene, not to seek revenge, but to give my son a chance to offer love to people who'd spent 5 years rejecting it. And if they chose rejection again, at least this time there would be witnesses. We drove to Maplewood in the late afternoon, the sky already darkening toward the long winter night. Tyler sat in the back seat with his headphones on, humming along to his favorite playlist, the painted handprint carefully wrapped in tissue paper on his lap. I'd dressed him in his nicest clothes, navy pants and a button-up shirt he'd actually agreed to wear because it was soft cotton instead of the scratchy material he couldn't stand. He looked beautiful and perfect and so achingly vulnerable that my heart hurt. The Morrison estate glowed like something out of a holiday movie. White lights dripped from every eave, candles flickered in every window, and I could see shapes moving inside, the party already in full swing. Cars lined the circular driveway, expensive vehicles that belonged to Maplewood's elite, the community leaders and business owners and social climbers who treated charity events like opportunities for networking. "Mom," Tyler said, pulling off his headphones. "There's a lot of people." "There are," I agreed. "Is that okay? We can leave if it's too much." He considered this seriously, the way he considered everything, processing each piece of information before making decisions that other kids his age made instinctively. "I want to give Grandma her present," he said finally. "Then maybe we can leave?" "Deal," I said, my throat tight with love for this boy who was braver than I'd ever be. We walked to the front door as a unit, Marcus's hand on my back, Tyler between us. Through the frosted glass, I could see the party in full swing, people in cocktail attire moving through rooms I'd once considered home. The wreath on the door was the same one my mother had used for 20 years, fresh pine and red velvet ribbon, my father's initials still woven into the greenery like a prayer. I rang the doorbell instead of walking in, a small acknowledgement that this was no longer my space to enter freely. We waited in the cold while footsteps approached, while someone's shadow grew larger behind the glass, while my heart hammered against my ribs with the force of 5 years of suppressed longing and rage. The door opened. Victoria stood there in a dress the color of champagne, her hair swept up, diamond earrings catching the light. She looked polished and perfect and completely unprepared for the sight of us on her mother's doorstep. "Caroline," she said, my name emerging strangled and sharp. "What are you doing here?" "We came to see Mom," I said, keeping my voice level. "Tyler made her a present." Tyler held up the wrapped handprint, his offering extended toward the aunt who'd spent 5 years treating him like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be known. Victoria didn't even glance at it, her eyes fixed on me with something close to panic. "We talked about this," she said, her voice low and urgent. "This is a family gathering." The words were identical to the ones she'd used 5 years ago, when she'd first decided Tyler's existence was too inconvenient for her holiday plans. But this time, I was ready for them. This time, I had 5 years of hard-won self-worth and professional accomplishment and fierce advocacy to armor me against their sting. "I know," I said, echoing the words I'd used in the opening moment of this confrontation. "That's why we're here." Before Victoria could respond, before she could close the door or call for security or do whatever she'd rehearsed for this nightmare scenario, my mother's voice carried from inside the house. Not speaking to the family this time, but to the gathered crowd of Maplewood's finest, her words amplified by the microphone she must have been using to address her guests. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight," Patricia Hayes Morrison said, her tone warm and gracious in a way I remembered from childhood piano recitals and school fundraisers. "This Christmas Eve celebration is about more than just gathering together. It's about recognizing the people in our community who make a difference, who dedicate their lives to helping others." Victoria's face went pale. I watched her throat work, watched her try to find words that wouldn't come. "Tonight," my mother continued, "I have the honor of acknowledging the incredible work being done at the Riverside Neurodiversity Center. Their programs have transformed how we support families with special needs children, and their founder has become a voice for inclusion and understanding throughout our state." The words floated through the open door like smoke, like ghosts, like every Christmas wish I'd ever made as a child, believing that if I was just good enough, smart enough, accomplished enough, my family would finally see me. "Please join me," my mother said, her voice swelling with pride that had never been directed at me, "in welcoming Dr. Diane Foster, who will accept this recognition on behalf of the center's founder, who unfortunately couldn't be with us tonight." The applause that followed was polite and scattered, the sound of people clapping because they were expected to, not because they were moved. But underneath it, I heard something else. A murmur of confusion, voices asking questions, someone saying, "I thought Caroline Hayes founded that center," loud enough to carry. Victoria's expression shifted from panic to something harder, more desperate. "You need to leave," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Right now, before anyone sees you." But it was too late. A woman appeared behind Victoria, someone I didn't recognize, her face curious and concerned. "Is everything all right?" she asked, then her eyes landed on me and widened in recognition. "Dr. Hayes? I thought you weren't coming tonight." Helen Crawford. I remembered her now, a member of the community center board, someone who'd attended one of my presentations on inclusive education practices. Someone who knew exactly who I was and what I'd built. "Helen," I said, my voice carrying past Victoria into the house. "I wasn't invited. But my son made his grandmother a Christmas present, and I thought she might want to have it." The words fell into the space between us like stones into still water, ripples spreading outward in every direction. Helen's expression shifted from confusion to understanding to something that looked almost like anger. She stepped around Victoria, effectively blocking my sister's attempt to close the door. "Patricia," Helen called back into the house, her voice cutting through the polite conversation and clinking glasses. "Patricia, you need to come to the door right now." The silence that followed felt alive, stretched taut like a wire about to snap. I could hear the party continuing in the background, oblivious voices and laughter, the clink of champagne flutes, someone complimenting the decorations. But at the doorway, time had suspended itself around the four of us, Victoria frozen in her champagne-colored dress, Helen Crawford standing firm as a wall between us and rejection, Tyler clutching his wrapped gift with both hands, and me trying to remember how to breathe. My mother appeared in the hallway, moving toward us with that gliding walk she'd perfected over decades of hosting social events. She wore navy blue, understated and elegant, pearls at her throat that had belonged to her own mother. For a split second, seeing her backlit by the warm glow of the house, I was 10 years old again, watching her get ready for one of her piano recitals, thinking she was the most beautiful woman in the world. Then she saw me, and her face transformed. Not with joy or surprise or even anger, but with something worse, the carefully constructed blankness of someone who'd been caught in a lie and was calculating how to maintain the fiction. "Caroline," she said, my name emerging careful and measured. Her eyes flicked to Tyler, then away so quickly it was like he'd burned her. "This is unexpected." Unexpected. 5 years of exile, and the best she could manage was unexpected. As if we'd simply shown up early to a party we'd been invited to, rather than appearing like ghosts at the feast, reminders of the family members she'd erased from her carefully curated narrative. "Hello, Mom," I said, and I was proud that my voice didn't shake. "Tyler wanted to give you something." Tyler stepped forward, his movements careful in the way they always were when he was processing too much input at once. He held out the wrapped handprint, his face serious and hopeful in equal measure. "I made this for you in art class," he said, his words clear despite the effort I knew it took him to speak when overwhelmed. "It's my hand. So you can keep it even when I'm not here." The gift hung in the air between them, my son's offering of love to a grandmother who'd spent 5 years pretending he didn't exist. My mother looked at it the way someone might look at a snake in their garden, something dangerous that had appeared where it didn't belong. She didn't reach for it. Didn't thank him. Didn't acknowledge the courage it took for an 8-year-old autistic boy to walk into this situation and try to build a bridge across 5 years of rejection. "Patricia," Helen said, her voice sharp with something I couldn't quite name. "Your grandson brought you a gift." The emphasis on grandson landed like a challenge. I watched my mother's jaw tighten, watched her scan the hallway behind her as if calculating who might be witnessing this moment, who might be close enough to hear. When she finally looked back at Tyler, it was with the tight smile she used to give piano students who'd forgotten their scales. "How thoughtful," she said, the words hollow. "Tyler, why don't you leave it on the table there, and I'll open it later." She pointed to the entry table, the one that held her crystal bowl of potpourri and a silver tray for keys, as if Tyler's gift was a piece of mail to be sorted through at her convenience. As if the child standing in front of her, dressed in his nicest clothes and trying so hard to be what she needed him to be, was less important than maintaining the fiction of her perfect family in front of her guests. Something in me cracked open, some carefully maintained dam of politeness and accommodation and protecting people who'd never protected me. "No," I said, the word emerging sharper than I'd intended. "He brought it for you. You can accept it from him directly, or you can tell him to his face that you don't want it." My mother's eyes snapped to mine, genuinely shocked. In our family, we didn't make scenes. We didn't voice discomfort or force confrontations or insist on acknowledgement when it wasn't freely given. We swallowed our hurt and smiled through holidays and protected the people who wounded us from the consequences of their choices. "Caroline, this is neither the time nor the place," my mother said, her voice dropping to the tone she used to use when I'd misbehaved as a child. "We have guests." "I know," I said. "One of whom is apparently accepting an award meant for me while you tell everyone I was too busy to attend. Funny how I had time to build the program but not to receive recognition for it." Helen made a small sound, something between vindication and anger. Victoria's face had progressed from pale to ashen, her eyes darting between our mother and me like she was watching a tennis match where the ball was made of grenades. "You don't understand," my mother started, but I cut her off. "No, I understand perfectly. You've spent 5 years erasing us from your life because Tyler's autism made you uncomfortable. Because including him required effort and patience and a willingness to adjust your expectations. Because it was easier to pretend you had 1 daughter and 2 grandchildren than to admit that real family requires showing up for people even when they're not convenient." My voice was rising despite my best efforts to control it. Tyler pressed closer to Marcus, his hand reaching for his father's, and I saw his other hand start to flap slightly, his body's way of regulating the stress he could feel radiating from every adult around him. The sight of him trying to self-soothe while simultaneously trying to give his grandmother a gift she clearly didn't want broke something fundamental in my chest. "You know what the worst part is?" I continued, unable to stop now that I'd started. "It's not that you excluded him from Christmas. Kids are resilient. We built new traditions. Tyler has friends who love him, teachers who celebrate him, an entire community of people who see his worth without conditions. The worst part is that you made him think something was wrong with him. That he was too much, too difficult, too different to deserve the same love you give Victoria's children." "That's not fair," Victoria interjected, finding her voice for the first time since my mother appeared. "We tried to include him. You're the one who couldn't accept that Tyler needed to meet us halfway, that we couldn't revolve everything around his needs." The words landed exactly where she'd aimed them, targeting every doubt I'd ever had about my parenting, every moment I'd wondered if I was doing enough or asking too much or failing to prepare Tyler for a world that wouldn't accommodate him. But 5 years of advocacy and education and connecting with other families who understood had armored me against this particular weapon. "Meeting you halfway would have meant teaching my son to suffer silently for your comfort," I said, looking directly at my sister. "It would have meant forcing him to endure sensory overload so you wouldn't have to explain to Natalie and Lucas why their cousin needed headphones or why he left the table when things got too loud. You didn't want to include Tyler. You wanted to include a version of him that doesn't exist, and when he couldn't be that child, you decided he was the problem instead of recognizing that your expectations were." Victoria's mouth opened and closed, no words emerging. For once in her perfectly composed life, she had no argument, no rationalization that could paper over the truth I'd just spoken. "Ladies," Helen said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I think we need to address what's actually happening here. Patricia, you told the board that Dr. Hayes was unavailable for personal reasons. You accepted recognition on behalf of a program she founded, without mentioning that she's your daughter or that you've been estranged from her. That's not just awkward. It's fraudulent." My mother flinched at the word, her composure cracking for the first time. "I didn't want to air family business in public," she said, her voice defensive. "No," Helen agreed. "You wanted to take credit for your daughter's accomplishments while maintaining the fiction that she doesn't exist. Do you have any idea how many people in that room right now have children who've been helped by Caroline's work? How many families she's supported through the exact kind of rejection you've subjected her to?" The color drained from my mother's face. I watched her realize, in real time, that this wasn't a private family matter anymore. That her carefully constructed image was about to shatter in front of the community she'd worked decades to impress. "I think," Helen continued, her voice softening slightly, "that everyone in that room deserves to know who actually built the program we're celebrating tonight. And I think Tyler deserves to give his grandmother the gift he made, and to have that gift received with the grace and gratitude any child offering love should expect." She turned to me then, her expression gentle but determined. "Dr. Hayes, would you be willing to come inside and accept the recognition yourself? To tell people about the work you've been doing?" It was a lifeline and a challenge wrapped together, an opportunity to step into the light that had been stolen from me while simultaneously forcing my mother to confront what she'd done in front of everyone who mattered to her. Part of me wanted to refuse, to maintain my dignity and walk away, to protect Tyler from witnessing whatever ugliness might follow. But another part, the part that had spent 5 years building something beautiful from the ashes of rejection, wanted them to see what they'd lost. "I need to know my son will be welcomed," I said, looking directly at my mother. "Not tolerated. Not accommodated with a list of rules designed to make him invisible. Welcomed as he is, with all his stimmying and humming and need for headphones when things get loud. If you can't promise that, then we'll leave right now, and you can continue pretending we don't exist." The challenge hung in the air between us. My mother looked at Tyler, really looked at him for the first time since we'd arrived, and I watched something shift in her expression. He was still holding the wrapped handprint, his face upturned toward hers, patient and hopeful in a way that children are before the world teaches them not to be. "Grandma," he said softly, "I use special paint. The kind that sparkles. Do you want to see?" It was such a simple question, asked with such pure intention, that I saw tears spring to my mother's eyes before she could stop them. She blinked them back, her composure fracturing around the edges, and for the first time in 5 years I saw something other than judgment or distance in her face. I saw regret. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, Tyler. I would like to see." He beamed, that full-face smile that lit him up from the inside, and carefully unwrapped the tissue paper to reveal the painted handprint. The glaze caught the light, blues and greens swirling together like ocean water, and in the center of the palm he'd pressed a small shell, something his art teacher must have helped him embed in the clay before it fired. "See," he said, pointing to the shell. That's from the beach. We went last summer. Dad said Grandpa used to take you to the beach when you were little, so I thought you might like remembering. The tears my mother had been holding back spilled over. She took the handprint from Tyler with shaking hands, her thumb tracing the outline of his palm preserved in clay, and something fundamental shifted in her expression. She wasn't looking at the difficult grandson anymore. She was looking at the child she'd lost, the relationship she'd sacrificed on the altar of comfort and conformity and what other people might think. It's beautiful, she said, and for once she sounded like she meant it. Tyler, it's the most beautiful gift anyone's ever given me. Tyler's smile grew even wider. He turned to me, his face radiating joy, and said, "See, Mom? I knew she'd like it. You worry too much." The simplicity of his faith, his ability to offer love without keeping score or holding grudges, his willingness to try even after years of rejection, it shattered every defense I'd built. I looked at my mother holding that painted handprint, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face, and I saw what Tyler had seen all along, not the grandmother who'd rejected him, but the grandmother he hoped she could still become. "Patricia," Helen said gently, "your guests are waiting." My mother nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand like a child rather than the composed matriarch she'd spent decades perfecting. She looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw her trying to find words that could bridge 5 years of silence. "I've made terrible mistakes," she said finally, her voice raw. "I don't know how to fix them." "You could start by inviting us inside," I said. "And introducing your grandson to the people who've been asking about him." Victoria made a sound of protest, but my mother held up her hand, silencing her for the first time I could remember. "You're right," she said, looking directly at me. "You're both right. I've been cruel, and I've justified it by pretending it was about what was best for everyone. But it was never about what was best. It was about what was easiest. And I'm ashamed." The admission hung in the cold December air, visible almost as breath, solid enough to touch. It wasn't enough. Years of hurt couldn't be dissolved by one apology, one moment of recognition. But it was something. It was a crack in the wall that had divided us, a possibility of light where there had been only darkness. "Mom," Victoria tried again, but this time there was desperation in her voice rather than authority. "Think about what you're doing. Think about Natalie and Lucas. They're not used to Tyler. They don't understand." "Then it's time they learned," my mother said, her voice finding strength. "It's time we all learned. Victoria, your sister has spent 5 years building something extraordinary while we've been busy protecting ourselves from discomfort. That ends tonight." She turned to me, still holding Tyler's handprint like it was made of glass. "Caroline, I can't undo what I've done. I can't give Tyler back the Christmases he missed or the relationship with his grandmother he deserved. But if you'll let me, I'd like to try to be the family you needed us to be. Starting right now." Marcus's hand found mine, his fingers lacing through my own, steady and grounding. I looked down at Tyler, at my beautiful boy who'd walked into the lion's den armed with nothing but a painted handprint and hope, and I realized that this moment wasn't really about me or my mother or even Victoria. It was about what kind of world I wanted Tyler to grow up in. One where family wounds stayed forever open, or one where healing was possible even when it seemed impossible. "Okay," I said, the word emerging smaller than I'd intended. "But if anyone makes Tyler feel unwelcome, if anyone treats him like he's a problem or an inconvenience, we leave. And we don't come back." "Understood," my mother said. She stepped aside, opening the door wider, an invitation and an apology combined. "Helen, would you mind telling everyone that we have a special guest? That the founder of the Riverside Neurodiversity Center has arrived, and she's brought her family?" Helen smiled, the expression fierce and satisfied. "It would be my absolute pleasure." We stepped over the threshold into warmth and light and the smell of pine and cinnamon, into a house I'd thought I'd never enter again. Tyler kept his headphones around his neck but accessible, his hand tight in mine as we moved through the entry hall toward the sound of conversation and music. I could feel Victoria behind us, her presence radiating disapproval and fear in equal measure, but my mother walked beside me, still clutching Tyler's handprint like a talisman. The living room fell silent as we entered, dozens of faces turning toward us with varying degrees of curiosity and confusion. I recognized some of them, community leaders I'd worked with on education initiatives, parents whose children attended programs at the center, Maplewood Society fixtures who'd known me as a girl and probably wondered what had happened to Patricia's younger daughter. And there, near the Christmas tree that dominated one corner of the room, were Victoria's children surrounded by presents wrapped in silver and gold, their faces registering surprise at our unexpected arrival. Helen moved to the center of the room, her voice carrying over the confused murmurs. "Everyone, I have an announcement. We were prepared to honor the Riverside Neurodiversity Center tonight through a representative, but it turns out the actual founder is here with us. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Caroline Hayes, whose groundbreaking work in inclusive education has transformed our community's approach to supporting neurodivergent children and their families." The applause started scattered and uncertain, people looking to each other for cues about how to react, but then someone in the back began clapping louder, and others joined, and within moments the room was filled with the sound of hands coming together. Not the polite, perfunctory applause my mother had received earlier, but something genuine, something that acknowledged not just professional accomplishment but personal courage. I stood there with Marcus on one side and Tyler on the other, my mother still beside me clutching her grandson's gift, and I felt something loosen in my chest that I'd been holding tight for 5 years. This wasn't the family I'd grown up in, wasn't the Christmas I'd once dreamed of having. But it was something. It was possibility. It was the first step on a road I hadn't known could still be traveled. A woman pushed through the crowd, her face flushed with emotion. I recognized her after a moment, Angela Martinez, whose son had been one of the first families to join the center 3 years ago. "Dr. Hayes," she said, her voice thick with feeling, "I need everyone here to know what this woman did for my family. When Daniel was diagnosed with autism, I was told by 3 different schools that he'd never function in a regular classroom, that I should just accept he'd need to be separated his whole life. Caroline fought for him. She created a program that didn't just accommodate him but celebrated him. He's in 4th grade now, thriving, with friends and confidence I never thought possible. She gave us our son back." More voices joined hers, a chorus of testimonials from parents who'd found their way to the center, who'd watched their children blossom under programs designed around understanding rather than compliance. I stood there feeling exposed and seen in equal measure, aware of Tyler leaning against my side, processing the strange experience of hearing his mother praised by strangers while his own family had spent years acting like we didn't matter. My mother's hand found my arm, her touch tentative like she was approaching something fragile that might break. "I didn't know," she whispered, so softly only I could hear. "I didn't know any of this. What you'd built, how many people you'd helped. I just saw what I wanted to see." I turned to look at her, this woman who'd taught me piano scales and how to frost a cake, who'd read me poetry when I was small and held me when my father died. Somewhere in the past 5 years, I'd transformed her in my mind into a villain, a 2-dimensional antagonist who'd rejected Tyler out of cruelty. But looking at her now, tears cutting through her makeup, still holding that painted handprint like it was precious, I saw something more complicated. Fear masquerading as judgment. Discomfort wrapped in the language of boundaries. A woman who'd spent so long caring what other people thought that she'd sacrificed her own grandchild to maintain an image that was never real to begin with. "You could have known," I said quietly. "I sent you updates. Articles. Photos of Tyler at his programs, achieving things doctors said he never would. You chose not to look." She nodded, accepting the truth of it without defense. "I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of what it would mean, of what people would say, of whether I could handle it. And I told myself it was about protecting Victoria's children, about maintaining peace in the family. But it was always about me. About my fear and my pride and my need to have everything look perfect from the outside." Helen had moved to stand beside the fireplace, giving people space to approach me, and I watched Victoria over my mother's shoulder. My sister stood frozen near the Christmas tree, her children pressed against her sides, her face a mask of something between horror and fury. She'd built 5 years of family life around Tyler's absence, had crafted a narrative where his exclusion was necessary and justified. And now that narrative was crumbling in front of everyone who mattered in her social circle. A man I didn't recognize stepped forward, extending his hand. "Dr. Hayes, I'm Thomas Chen, superintendent of the Maplewood School District. I've been trying to reach you for months about consulting on our special education programs. Your mother told me you'd moved out of state." The lie landed between us, another small revelation of how thoroughly my family had erased me. I shook his hand, keeping my voice professional despite the anger simmering underneath. "I live in Portland, Maine. About 2 hours from here. I've been in state the entire time." Thomas's eyebrows rose, his gaze flickering toward my mother before returning to me. "I see. Well, I'd very much like to discuss having you work with our district. We're facing exactly the kind of challenges your center has been addressing, and frankly, we're failing our neurodivergent students." Tyler tugged on my sleeve, his way of getting my attention without interrupting when I was talking to someone. I looked down to see him pointing toward Victoria's children, who were staring at him with the frank curiosity of kids who'd been told stories about someone without ever meeting them. "That's Natalie and Lucas," he said, more statement than question. "Can I show them my rock collection? I brought some in my backpack." My heart clenched. Of course he'd brought his rocks, his special interest, the thing that brought him joy and comfort when the world got overwhelming. He'd packed them thinking maybe, just maybe, this would be the Christmas his cousins would want to know him. "That's up to their mom," I said, looking toward Victoria, putting the choice squarely in her court in front of everyone who'd just heard about the center's work, about children like Tyler deserving acceptance and celebration. Victoria's jaw tightened, her eyes meeting mine across the room. I could see the calculation happening behind her expression, the social mathematics of what refusing would mean in this moment, in front of these people. But I also saw something else, something more uncomfortable, the realization that her children were old enough to understand what was happening, to recognize that their mother was actively preventing them from knowing their cousin. "Natalie, Lucas," Victoria said finally, her voice strained. "Tyler would like to show you something. Would you like to see?" Natalie, 10 years old now and so much taller than the last time I'd seen her, nodded slowly. Lucas, only 6, looked uncertain but curious. Tyler beamed and carefully shrugged off his backpack, unzipping it to reveal a collection of stones wrapped in tissue paper, each one labeled in his careful handwriting with details about where he'd found it and what kind of rock it was. "This one's quartz," he said, holding up a milky white stone with crystal formations. "I found it near the river. Quartz is silicon dioxide and it forms in hexagonal crystals." "Do you know what hexagonal means?" Lucas shook his head, and Tyler launched into an explanation of crystal structures with the passionate intensity he brought to all his special interests. I watched Victoria's children lean in, genuinely interested, and I saw Victoria's face transform as she witnessed what she'd been denying them. A cousin who was different, yes, but also fascinating and kind and eager to share what he loved. Marcus had moved to stand with my mother near the fireplace, and I saw them talking quietly, his posture protective but not hostile. Helen joined Thomas Chen and me, her expression satisfied like she'd personally orchestrated this entire evening's reversal. "I have to admit," Helen said quietly, "I've been waiting for this moment for months. When Patricia submitted paperwork claiming to represent the center's founder, I knew something wasn't right. I've been following your work for years, Dr. Hayes. I know what you look like." When she described you as unavailable, I started asking questions. Ruth was very helpful. So Aunt Ruth had been more than just a messenger. She'd been actively working to expose what my mother had tried to hide. I made a mental note to call her, to thank her for refusing to be complicit in my erasure. More people approached throughout the evening, a steady stream of parents and teachers and community members who wanted to share stories about the center's impact, to ask questions about programs, to simply shake my hand and say thank you. Tyler eventually settled on the floor near the tree with Natalie and Lucas, the three of them arranging his rock collection by color and then by size, his cousins asking questions and Tyler answering with the encyclopedic knowledge he'd accumulated about geology. I watched Victoria watching them, saw her face cycle through emotions too complex to name. At one point, Natalie said something that made Tyler laugh, his real laugh, the one that sounded like pure joy translated into sound. Victoria's eyes filled with tears, and I understood what she was realizing. She denied her children this relationship, this cousin who could teach them about rocks and acceptance and the beauty of being exactly who you are. She'd chosen comfort over connection, and in doing so, she'd stolen something from her own kids as much as from Tyler. My mother had disappeared into the kitchen at some point, and when she returned, she was carrying a plate of cookies shaped like stars and trees, Tyler's favorites from when he was small. She knelt beside the 3 children, offering them the plate, her movements careful like she was approaching something wild that might spook. "Tyler," she said, her voice tentative, "I remember you used to love these. I made them this morning. I hoped maybe someday I'd have a chance to share them with you again." Tyler looked up from his rocks, considered the cookies seriously, then selected a star. "Thank you, Grandma," he said, taking a bite. "These are really good. Did you use real vanilla?" "Mom says real vanilla makes things taste better than fake vanilla." "Real vanilla," my mother confirmed, and I heard her voice crack slightly. "Always real vanilla." It was such a small moment, a grandmother offering cookies to her grandson, but it carried the weight of 5 years of missed opportunities. 5 years of birthday cookies not baked, of Halloween candy not given, of Christmas mornings where Tyler woke up in a house that didn't include the grandmother who should have been there to see him open presents. Ruth appeared beside me, materializing from the crowd like she'd been waiting for the right moment. "You came," she said simply. "You knew I would," I replied. "I hoped," she corrected. Hope and certainty are different animals. "I'm proud of you, Caroline. For showing up, for building something beautiful out of what they tried to break. Your father would be proud too." The mention of my father, dead now for 16 years, hit harder than I expected. "Dad never really understood me either," I said. "He would have been confused by Tyler, by the diagnosis, by all of it." "Maybe," Ruth agreed. "But he would have shown up anyway. That was always his gift, showing up even when he didn't understand. Your mother forgot that about him. She's been so busy performing the role of the perfect widow that she forgot what made him a good man in the first place." Victoria approached us then, her posture defensive but her eyes uncertain. "Can we talk?" she asked, directing the question at me while pointedly ignoring Ruth. "Privately?" I looked at Tyler, still happily arranging rocks with his cousins, then at Marcus, who nodded slightly. 5 minutes, I said. We stepped into my father's old study, a room that had been preserved like a museum to his memory. His engineering books still lined the shelves, his drafting table still sat by the window, his reading glasses still rested on the desk like he'd just stepped away for a moment. Victoria closed the door behind us, and for a long moment we just stood there, 2 sisters who'd once shared everything, now strangers in the house where we'd grown up. "I don't know how to do this," Victoria said finally. "I don't know how to admit I was wrong, how to apologize for 5 years of cruelty dressed up as boundaries. I told myself I was protecting my children, but watching them with Tyler tonight, seeing how easily they connected, I realized I was only protecting myself." "From what?" I asked, genuinely curious. "From having to explain," she said. "From having to answer questions about why Tyler was different, from having to adjust our routines, from having to admit that my vision of a perfect family didn't include room for neurodivergence. It was easier to exclude you both than to do the work of understanding." The honesty was unexpected, and I didn't know what to do with it. Part of me wanted to accept the apology and move forward, to believe that people could change and families could heal. But another part, the part that had held Tyler while he cried asking why his grandmother didn't love him, that part wanted Victoria to understand that some harm couldn't be undone with words. "Do you know what Tyler asked me last Christmas?" I said quietly. "He asked if maybe he could write Grandma a letter, explaining how his brain works, so she wouldn't be scared of him anymore. He was 7 years old, and he'd decided that the problem wasn't your rejection but his failure to help you understand. That's what you taught him, Victoria. That his existence was a problem he needed to solve." Victoria's face crumpled. She sat in my father's old chair, the leather cracked and worn, and put her face in her hands. "I don't know how to fix it," she said, her voice muffled. "I don't know how to give back what I took." "You can't," I said simply. "You can't give back 5 years of Christmases or birthday parties or Sunday dinners. You can't undo the message you sent him that he wasn't good enough, wasn't easy enough, wasn't worth the effort of inclusion. But you can choose differently going forward. You can let Natalie and Lucas know their cousin. You can show up for him now, even though you didn't before. You can teach your children that family means loving people even when it's uncomfortable. What if I can't? Victoria asked, looking up at me with eyes that reminded me of when we were young, when she used to come to my room during thunderstorms because she was afraid. What if I try and I fail? What if I hurt him again? Then you'll hurt him again, I said. But at least he'll know you tried. At least he'll see that people can change, that exclusion isn't permanent, that love sometimes shows up late but it still counts. And maybe that lesson, as painful as it is, will be more valuable than 5 years of unconditional acceptance would have been. A knock on the door interrupted us. Marcus opened it slightly, his face apologetic. "Tyler's asking for you," he said. "I think the crowd is getting to be too much." I nodded and turned back to Victoria. "I need to go. But think about what you want your children to learn from this. Because right now, you're teaching them that it's okay to exclude people who make you uncomfortable. Is that really the legacy you want to leave them?" I left her sitting in my father's chair, surrounded by his books and blueprints, reminders of a man who'd built bridges for a living. As I walked back into the living room, I thought about the bridges my father had built out of steel and concrete, permanent structures that could withstand storms and time. The bridges I was trying to build with my family were more fragile, constructed from forgiveness and hope and the willingness to try again after being hurt. Tyler was standing near Marcus, his headphones now on, his body language signaling that he was approaching his limit. I could read the signs after 8 years, the way his shoulders had crept up toward his ears, the slight rocking motion he was doing without realizing it, the distant look in his eyes that meant he was retreating inward to cope with overstimulation. "Ready to go?" I asked quietly, and he nodded with visible relief. My mother appeared as we were gathering our things, her face pale but determined. "Will you come back?" she asked. "Not tonight, I know tonight was too much. But maybe for lunch next week? Just you and Marcus and Tyler? No crowd, no pressure. Just family trying to figure out how to be family again." I looked at Tyler, giving him the choice. He considered it with his usual seriousness, then nodded slowly. "Can I bring more rocks?" he asked. "I have some really good ones at home. And maybe Grandma would want to learn about them." "I would love to learn about them," my mother said, and this time when she smiled at Tyler, it reached her eyes. "I would love to learn about everything I've missed." We left the Morrison estate at 8:30, Tyler exhausted in the back seat, the lights of the house fading behind us as Marcus drove toward Portland. I felt hollowed out and full simultaneously, like I'd been carrying something heavy for so long that putting it down left me unsteady on my feet. "You did good," Marcus said quietly, his hand finding mine across the center console. "I'm proud of you. For showing up, for speaking truth, for giving them a chance even though they didn't deserve it." "I didn't do it for them," I said. "I did it for him. So he'd know that families can heal, even when they break badly. So he'd see that standing up for yourself doesn't mean giving up on people. So he'd learn that love sometimes looks like boundaries and sometimes looks like bridges, and knowing which one to use is what makes you wise instead of just hurt." Tyler's soft snoring filled the car, his head tilted against the window, the streetlights painting shadows across his peaceful face. He'd survived his first real confrontation with the family that had rejected him, and he'd done it with grace and rocks and an open heart that put all of us to shame. The lunch happened the following Tuesday, not in the formal dining room where my mother usually entertained but in the kitchen where we'd spent countless afternoons of my childhood. She'd made grilled cheese sandwiches cut into triangles the way Tyler liked them, and she'd cleared the entire kitchen table so he could spread out his rock collection without worrying about knocking anything over. Tyler talked for 40 minutes straight about sedimentary versus igneous formations, about how pressure and time could transform one thing into something completely different. My mother listened with the same focused attention she used to give her piano students, asking questions that showed she was genuinely trying to understand. When Tyler showed her a piece of granite flecked with mica, she held it up to the light and said it reminded her of stars, and Tyler's face lit up with the joy of someone whose passion has been recognized rather than tolerated. Victoria came by toward the end, without her children, without her armor of perfect hair and designer clothes. She sat at the table and watched Tyler explain crystal structures to our mother, and when he offered to show her his favorite stone, a smooth river rock he'd been carrying in his pocket for 2 years, she held it like it mattered. That was 3 months ago. We've had 6 more lunches since then, and last week Victoria brought Natalie and Lucas. The 5 children, because by then Marcus and I had started bringing Tyler's best friends from the center, spent 2 hours in the backyard building what Tyler called a geology laboratory, which was really just a card table covered in rocks and magnifying glasses. But Victoria sat on the back steps and watched her children learn from their cousin, and when Natalie asked if Tyler could come to her school to give a presentation about rocks, Victoria said yes without hesitation. My mother still has moments where she doesn't understand, where Tyler's needs confuse her or his behaviors make her uncomfortable. But she's learning to sit with that discomfort instead of using it as an excuse for exclusion. She bought books about autism. She joined a grandparents' support group. She volunteered at the center, helping with administrative work, seeing firsthand the impact of the programs I'd built from the rubble of our family's rejection. Last week, she called me crying. Not sad crying, but the overwhelmed kind that comes from finally understanding something you should have known all along. She'd been filing paperwork at the center and came across testimonials from families we'd helped. One was from a grandmother who'd written about learning to love her autistic grandson not despite his differences but because of the unique way he saw the world. My mother said reading it felt like looking in a mirror at who she could have been 5 years ago if she'd chosen courage over comfort. I don't know if we'll ever fully heal. Some wounds leave scars that ache when the weather changes, that remind you of what broke even after it's been mended. But we're trying, which is more than I thought possible that Christmas Eve when I stood on her doorstep with Tyler's painted handprint and 5 years of hurt crystallized into armor. Victoria and I are rebuilding too, slowly, carefully, like architects working with damaged foundations. We'll never be the sisters who shared clothes and secrets, but we're learning to be the sisters who show up for each other's children, who acknowledge harm without letting it define us, who choose connection over comfort even when it's hard. Tyler turned 9 last month. His birthday party was at the center, surrounded by friends who celebrate his stimming and understand his need for quiet spaces and think his rock collection is the coolest thing they've ever seen. But for the first time in 5 years, his grandmother was there too. She gave him a book about geology and a display case for his favorite specimens, and when he hugged her, unself-conscious and full of forgiveness he didn't even know he was offering, I saw my mother close her eyes and hold on like she was memorizing the feeling. That night, after everyone had gone home and Tyler was asleep with his new geology book on his chest, Marcus found me sitting in our backyard looking at stars. He didn't say anything, just sat beside me the way he always did, present and steady and sure. I used to think family was the people who shared your blood, I said quietly. The people who were there from the beginning, who were supposed to love you automatically because that's what family does. But I've learned that family is the people who show up. Sometimes they're related to you, and sometimes they're the friends who become your chosen family. Sometimes they're the therapists and teachers and other parents who understand what you're carrying. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the people who should have been family all along figure out how to actually become it. Marcus squeezed my hand. Tyler's lucky to have you, he said. To have us. To have built a life where he knows his worth isn't conditional. I thought about that painted handprint, still sitting on my mother's mantel now, displayed prominently where everyone who enters her home can see it. I thought about Tyler offering it with open hands, believing his grandmother would accept it even after years of rejection. I thought about the courage it takes to keep offering love to people who've proven they might not return it, and about how my son had taught me more about grace and resilience than I'd ever taught him. The work continues. At the center, we're expanding programs. In my family, we're learning new ways of being together. Tyler grows taller and more himself every day, building a life where his differences are strengths and his needs are met without shame. And I keep building bridges, some out of professional expertise and some out of hope and forgiveness, connecting the isolated places where people like Tyler are made to feel like they don't belong. Some bridges hold. Some collapse under the weight of old wounds and new expectations. But the act of building them, of believing connection is possible even after devastating breaks, that's the work that matters. That's the legacy I want to leave my son, not a world without pain or rejection, but the knowledge that love, real love, shows up even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.